All right, my happy little English teacher. So, for today's writing workshop, I got a good one for you. So, I created something called the Happiness Project. And what I've done is compiled 15 poems, all centering around the title of happiness. And it stems from this. I was getting ready to do the March Madness poetry breakdown, like a lot of AP literature teachers do. And a student said, "Oh my God, everything we do is so damn depressing. Like, why do we have to read this stuff?" And I said, I really want to incorporate more SEL into my classroom. I think we all do, but have trouble with time constraints and curricular demands to really do those types of things. So I'm a hippy dippy type teacher. I wear Birkenstocks in the winter and I do a lot of meditation and mindfulness with my students, even at the AP level. But I'm like, it's true. A lot of the stuff that we focus on in terms of our literature tends to be a little dour and down. So I'm like, all right, I could do a little happiness in the month of March. It's the longest month. We're at the precipice of spring here in upstate New York. So I said, all right, let's do it. Let's have at it. So I'm going to show you my happiness project here. Of the 15 poems, I chose one, Raymond Carver's Happiness. Raymond Carver is one of my favorite poets. And Raymond Carver is now the off limits poem. My students cannot write about it because I'm going to Bob Ross my instruction in just a second and show you and your students. So while I'm doing mine exclusively on Raymond Carver's Happiness, the students can choose any of the other 14 poems. So since I'm modeling it for them, I don't want them stealing my thunder. I don't want them mimicking me or mocking my words or stealing sentences or anything of that nature. So Raymond Carver is off limits. All 14 others are fair game. So here's a list of the authors that I compiled, all title Happiness. So I'll give you a quick glance there. And I found all of these poems on the Poetry Foundation website. So you can gather them there. And I downloaded them and made a packet and just put it in Google Classroom for my students. But those are the authors, so pretty good wide array, and some contemporary, some old school. So really good for AP literature, but even if you're doing an on-level class and doing a poetry unit with them, these are all good poems, wide variety. So in terms of complexity too, and in terms of learning terms, devices, techniques, you got it. It's ready made for you. So, as I said, I'm going to do Carver's Happiness. And the first question we got to ask ourselves is this. So, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And nothing's going to change here, my friends, especially for those that are familiar with my work. So, we're doing literary analysis. So, we're going to invert the thesis. So, always, 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 and this is true for all FRQs on the AP literature exam, you can invert the thesis. So my declarative model I use exclusively for rhetorical analysis. And then when you get into the other expository modes of persuasion, argument, synthesis, and research, it's a 50-50 coin flip. It's totally contingent upon the prompt and the tone in which you want to establish your argument. So you can 50-50 flip for the other expository modes. But for lit analysis, we are inverting the whole way. So as always, I'm always peddling that question, what if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? So I'm going to Bob Ross this for you and your students and get to my proverbial easel and canvas and paint a bunch of introductions and body paragraphs for you so as to demystify the process. One thing I always encourage teachers to do when I work with them at the National Writing Project or when I'm doing my consulting is this. You, no matter what, teacher, are the expert writer in the classroom. Get up there and paint with your students. And I know it's kind of scary. I've worked with a lot of teachers, and some of them are terrified by this prospect, but it ain't so bad, especially if you're using templates. I think Bob Ross always used his wet on wet technique every time he did a natural landscape. He called it a heuristic, and in composition, we call it templates. So it's very easy to elucidate for students how to proceed through a paper so that it doesn't feel like guesswork to them all the time. Because I think when we assign, expectations are rather arbitrary and haphazard, and therefore it's going to reflect in the student's writing. They're not going to know what to do. So they're just guessing. So implicit in any prompt. So if we go back to the 1970s and look at the poetry prompts for the AP Literature exam. So over 40 years, implicit in every prompt, you have two questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So I know some teachers ask about universal theme or exigence or something of that nature. I just say, what's the authorial intent? And then how does the author construct meaning? So here's how this works for my students. They're going to take 3 sentences and answer what is the authorial intent. Those are going to be the first 3 sentences of the introductory paragraph. The last sentence is going to be, how does the author construct meaning? And that's the thesis. That's why we call this as an inverted thesis, because you end with the thesis. And when you drop your thesis, you need to drop your terms, devices, techniques. So in terms of the Carver poem, what's the most salient thing he does on a literary level? So like 1 or 2 lit terms, devices, techniques that comprise the whole meaning, that really are like the scaffolds of the poem. So it's 3, authorial intent, 1, construction of meaning. So let's look at that in diagram form. So it literally looks like a triangle, and oftentimes I make graphic organizers that are in this triangulated shape for students. And you just plug it in. 3, authorial intent as you funnel down, 1, construction of meaning. Now there's more stuff that needs to go into these introductory paragraphs. 1 comes from my Word Study Academy, and this is something that I run with my students all academic year. I know in my 21 years of teaching that the vocabulary void is becoming exponentially larger and larger and larger in terms of that chasm. So I, as the teacher, need to fill it. I need to help my students fill it. We're doing academic writing, so I expect an academic tone. Most of my students come to me with really small vocabs, and unless I have readers, and I don't, as I advance in my career, I have fewer and fewer readers, and I think a lot of teachers are experiencing that. So I do a lot of really focused, intentional word studies, and you'll see at the time here in March, I'm recording this in the middle of March, my students have had me since September 7th. Their vocabularies have grown exponentially, and if you want to learn more about my word study academies, you can check out my work with National Writing Project, or just browse through the YouTube channel. I have some things in there. Sentence constructs. I'm all about the unicorn point at the AP level, the elusive point of sophistication. I think it's between the vocabulary, they have to cop a certain tone, and then the sentence constructs. In order to achieve voice rhythm and flow, students need to be able to wield more than independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences. And my 2 buddies, Strunk and White, wrote a book called Write It Right. And in it, they have something called rule number 18. And they suggest that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So when I Bob Ross this, I'm going to show you how to flex some syntactical maneuvers. And ultimately, I want students to be able to transfer the vocabulary and the sentence constructs, the fluidity of the sentences, into their introductions. And as I've already alluded to, it's going to be 4 sentences long. Every introduction, no matter the expository modes, while you're manipulating my templates, are going to be 4 sentences long. So here's my first one. I'm going to go 3, authorial intent, 1, construction of meaning. Note the vocab, note the sentence constructs. Unlike common conceptions, happiness is not packaged in some grandiose expression, and it isn't some blown up affair. Instead, the ineffable qualities of joy and serenity are wrapped up in the seemingly small and insignificant things of life. In fact, one often finds a slice of happiness when they pause just long enough to absorb calm simplicities. So I'm 3 sentences in, and I basically got the exigence. I got the thesis, the universal theme, the truthiness of Raymond Carver's poem. That's the whole thing. Now notice, I'm not plot summarizing. You really got to caution students against this. No plot summary at all. We're writing literary analysis, not plot analysis. So don't retell the story of the poem. You're focusing pretty heavily on the thematic aspect of it. Last sentence, what is Carver doing to create this in terms of his literary manipulation, his devices? Raymond Carver expresses such an epiphany through his interplay of dark and light imagery. So my contention in reading that poem is you got the binary or the juxtaposition of the dark and light imagery. And I think that is the crux of the poem. So I'm going to stick that as my thesis. So light and dark imagery are the most salient things in that poem. So again, 3 + 1. Note the vocab, note the sentence constructs. So I step to my easel and go to the canvas one more time to demonstrate for students how to do this. And I just say, hey guys, I'm going to do 3 + 1 again. Check it out. A big secret of life is this: happiness can be sought and found in seemingly insignificant things. But for many, happiness tends to be slippery and elusive because it is perceived as being this big, unwieldy, distant thing. The truth of the matter is that nothing is impossible, such as finding true happiness, if one breaks it up into its smaller pieces. And that's, again, the exigence. Raymond Carver finds happiness in just 2 boys delivering his newspaper as he looks out the window. Like, he wakes up, it's pre-dawn, it's dark, he's feeling rather bleak and dour, and just watching the innocence of the boys, the sun begins to come up, and so does his mood. So all of that's correlated. How do I express that in the thesis? Look at this. Raymond Carver arrives at such an understanding through the of dark and light imagery in his poem Happiness. So again, I think, the most salient thing is that dichotomy, the binary, the juxtaposition, the imagery. So just state it simply, right? You don't have to come to that last thesis statement there and have a literary terms dumping ground. Just the big one, just the exigence of it. So I step to the easel, the canvas for a third time. Again, 3 + 1, focus on those tier 2s, focus on the sentence constructs. This one I did a little bit more manipulation of the syntax just to jazz it up a little bit. It has been said that man always stumbles over the pebbles of life, never over the mountains. And this is especially true of the individual quest to find happiness. The truth of the matter is this: happiness is so easy to find and hold, one just needs to look in the small spaces of life to locate it. So look at the last sentence again. Raymond Carver comes to such an understanding in his poem Happiness through the dichotomous interchange between light and dark imagery. So I just said dichotomy, just changed it up a little bit. So every single time a student's do an introduction for literary analysis, again, it holds true for all FRQs for the lit exam. Inverted thesis every single time it works. And I have plenty of stuff in the YouTube channel to demonstrate that. So the next question we need to ask is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And again, for those that are familiar with my work, I always say this: proceed syllogistically. Again, it does not matter the expository mode. Lit analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, it does not matter. The syllogistic works like a charm. And again, it's the beauty of using templates. It totally demystifies the process for kids. So I'm going to give a quick flyby for those that are unfamiliar with the syllogistic method, and then I'll just invite you to go into the YouTube channel if you want to do a deeper dive, because I have plenty of videos on this. So the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out these juicy, pithy questions like, what is justice? Which is the basis of the book Plato's Republic. So these great philosophical think tankers would come to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle observed, just like composition teachers, some kids are better at that than others. So same goes for our writing. And he asked himself, what are the really good orators doing? And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, aha, I got it. They're very computative, they're very mathematical, they're very logical, they're very cogent in how they stack their argument. And he said they're going premise, conclusion. So let me give you an example of that. If I were to say arsenic is deadly, you'd all nod your head and say, yep, that's the truth. And then I were to say premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. We would all probably say, uh-oh, your dog's going to die, right? That's logic. So deductive, inductive reasoning, however you want to spin it. That's how students need to proceed through a body paragraph. Oftentimes, and I'll do a video on this or a webinar sometime down the road, oftentimes if we look at College Board sample papers, students only present the second premise. And it's the big faux pas of writing. When you only present the second premise, you switch the expository mode to plot analysis, not literary analysis. Students retell the story of the poem in their own words. It's kind of like they give a Cliff Note summation of it, if you will. And you can't do that. So we got to make sure we're arguing our terms, devices, techniques. So in terms of busting out a template for the purposes of literary analysis, this is how it's going to look. Premise 1 is an argument containing the terms, the devices, the techniques. And this is going to be a 3-sentence move. On FRQ 1 of the AP language exam, the College Board states 3 times, your argument must be central. And I tell that to all my students, on-level students and even AP students. Expository writing is an act of argumentation, so you got to argue. So I don't want my students quoting or paraphrasing up early in those topic sentences, because it stands to reason they will switch the expository mode to plot analysis. So it's just kind of a safety trap to make sure that the argument stays central. So 3 sentences for that. I'll model it. Premise 2 is textual support. I like to see a teeter-totter balance between the quoting and the paraphrasing. I don't like it when students do one far more at the expense of the other, and I really don't like quote dumps. So I'll show you some tricks to get students beyond those little hiccups. And then the conclusion, and I want to be very careful in articulating this. It's the conclusion of the body paragraph. Body paragraphs need conclusions. You just can't like run like heck away from a quote, or go in mid-sentence and just disappear into the next body paragraph. You got to wrap those guys up. So you're going to link it back to the prompt. Make sure you keep the promise of the first premise and echo the thesis. It all comes full circle. A syllogism's a circle. And then here's one last thing, some more math. So first premise is going to be 3 sentences. The entire length of a syllogistic body paragraph, I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences. Probably don't go more than 12 sentences. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that our students write sometimes, I just don't think they advance the argument enough. And then when students do that, they often do this. They go 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph conflict. And it's too methodic, too dutiful, definitely going to preclude them from getting the sophistication point. So note in these 3 sentences how there are multiple terms, devices, techniques. This is what I mean by multitasking the first premise. A point to get the sophistication point, students need to see how the pieces interlock with each other, how the lit terms kind of hold hands with each other and complement and correspond with each other. So in taking 3 sentences, students can begin to tie those terms, devices, techniques together. Question that is often posed to me is this: where do I begin, Mr. Kuhn? And in the first body paragraph, I tell my students to begin where the author starts. So this right here, right from the onset, if you go through my entire YouTube channel, most of my students are going to transition into the first body paragraph with these exact words. It cues the reader into knowing that you have chronology, you have sequence, and that you're going to be organized as you drop your line of reason and develop your line of reason. So check how this goes. Right from the onset, Carver establishes the 2 contrasting moods of the poem by casting the setting in the pre-dawn darkness. So I got mood, I got setting. Do you see how I multitask there? In doing so, the light and dark imagery are ascribed both literal and figurative meanings. So I'm going to do some hardcore diction analysis here of light and dark imagery, literal and figurative meanings. So now I have mood, setting, literal, figurative. As the narrator begins to shift into a happier sense of well-being, The syntactical maneuvers help signal this change and awakening as well. So I got syntax. So now, in order to stay cogent and in order to keep my line of reasoning, I need quotes and or paraphrase for mood, quotes and or paraphrases for setting, quotes and or paraphrases, literal and figurative meaning, quotes and or paraphrases for syntax. I do not necessarily need to go in that computative in order, but I do need to bring all of that stuff into my second premise for the line of reasoning to stay intact. If I don't, I break my line of reasoning. Plus, if I bring anything else into the frame, I break my line of reasoning. So I always tell my students the first premise is a promise. You have to adhere to this now. So another little sentence stem that my students have is this. The first word of their second premise is usually immediately. It ties back to right from the onset to keep the chronology going. So I'm going to have a quote or paraphrase for that setting and the mood. So look at this. Immediately, the scene is described as being so early it's almost dark out. The narrator in this pre-sunrise moment is literally sitting by his window beset with a certain sense of sadness. Again, do you see how that all connects here? That's a perfect quote to get to the mood and the setting. I got it. Peg, check. Regardless of the reasons, which we are not made aware of, the mundane and usual early morning stuff passes for thought. Now, let me talk to you about a template within the template. My students do something called the 5-word rule. And if you place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, so not exactly, but a minimum of 5 words in the quote or before the quote, and keep the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational, right? I want these quotes to be very flowy, very supple. That's essential for the sophistication point. All right, is to be able to have silky smooth quote transitions. So whenever we quote, we got to analyze. Just as the skyline is literally dark, the narrator's mood is also dark on a figurative level. So why am I talking about this? So I promised you in the first premise, right? Go back, literal and figurative meanings. But the sudden sight of the newspaper boys enjoying a carefree moment triggers a transition not only in tone but in mood. Syntactically, Carver terminates a dependent clause with a period in the third sentence. So why am I doing this? Because I promised you an analysis of the syntactical maneuver. I'm not going to quote that line because it's too long. I'm just going to paraphrase it. So that's where you get into that teeter-totter balance of the quoting and the paraphrasing. So I continue on to the next slide. I'm out of space, so this is still one paragraph. This intentional move is employed to mark the abrupt end of his downtrodden mood. In merely looking out his window, he observes that they are so happy they aren't saying anything. This simple moment, 2 boys happily delivering a newspaper, elicits a sudden spark of light, happiness in the narrator. The sky, like the mood, literally and figuratively takes on light. So let's go back here. Did I keep the promise of the first premise? I got mood, I got setting, I got the imagery in terms of the literal and figurative meanings and implications of the light-dark imagery, and peg syntax. Did anything else come into this? Nope. So I'm hovering around 10, 12 sentences. So now I got to wrap it up. Go back to the prompt, go back to the thesis, go back to the first premise, full circle. States of happiness and their comings and goings are oftentimes unexpected and ineffable. But Carver can name his happiness. Simply seeing the innocence of youth brings rays of sunshine to his time-worn heart. Boom, I think that took 11 sentences, all right? So now, in doing this, in Bob Rossing this, my students have the other 14 poems to look at. I've demystified it for them. They should know clearly how to execute this based on my lead. So the question is this: what do I do next? What do I do in the second body paragraph? Bust out another syllogism. There's so many more terms, devices, techniques that we have not analyzed yet. And in terms of going chronologically through the poem, we're at the middle, so we still have the middle to the end to analyze. Just, again, do 3 sentences, first premise, 10 to 12 sentences total. Switch up the quotes, switch up the paraphrases, Keep that line of reasoning. So I'm often asked this. In fact, I got a couple of emails this week. How many paragraphs do my students do on the exam? For both Lit and Lang, my students only do 4 paragraphs. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. And they've never been penalized on that. I have some teachers that are like, oh my God, no way, it has to be 5 paragraphs. Nope, nope, nope. 4 paragraphs is totally fine. So intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So that's where I would take my students on this journey of the happiness project. So if you have any questions or need any unpacking, feel free to give me an email, a message at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also note that I have a ton of professional development offerings, some free, some for a nominal fee, at the National Writing Project. So I'm a lead teacher there, and we've teamed up to do a number of undertakings throughout the calendar year. So if you want more information on any of my consulting gigs or my PD offerings, check out my website at teachinghowtowrite.com. So hope this serves you well. Be happy, happy teaching, happy writing.